Welcome to this presentation on libertarianism. By way of overview, we're going to be looking at five things in connection to libertarianism: freedom, plunder, prohibiting plunder, the danger of legal plunder, and free market capitalism. So background to libertarianism. Today's most influential libertarians emerged in the 19th century, the 1800s. Certainly the idea has been around before that, but most of the thinking that's developed in American history has been connected to the 1800s. Some of these folks would include Frederick Bastiat, John Stuart Mill, and Herbert Spencer. And obviously in the 20th century, people like Ludwig von Mises and the politician Ron Paul are important libertarian thinkers. And there are many, many more that would be important today as well. So some background to libertarianism. Libertarianism contains a mixture of conservative, classical liberal, and ideas that are unique to libertarianism. To compare it with conservatism, a couple of things that stand out. Um, Libertarians would accept the conservative idea of a flawed humanity. They would reject subservience to a transcendent morality. Uh, Comparing to classical liberals, libertarians would accept natural rights, but reject the idea that they're God-given. They would suggest that they just belong to people themselves directly. They would reject the overemphasis as well on human progress and goodness of classical liberals. When you compare libertarianism to both of those ideas, they would certainly agree with economic freedom, capitalism, and they would also then, though, suggest a much more expansive view of freedom overall, and a more restrictive view of government powers. That's really the key concept within libertarianism, is this idea of the much more expansive view of freedom and much greater limitation on government power, which kind of sets them apart from other political viewpoints. So that's where we begin. Libertarianism, the core principle, the central principle of libertarianism is freedom. And for a libertarian, this is each person's natural right to life, liberty, and property. For a libertarian, these are the three basic requirements of life: the right to protect your life, the right to your liberty, and the right to your property. And libertarians would argue that each person then has the fundamental right to lawfully defend these basic natural rights. So for a libertarian who believes deeply in the idea of personal freedom, Um, the great danger to that is what a libertarian would call plunder. So people in the libertarian construct are naturally self-interested. People will act in their self-interest. It's a natural thing. I think it's a real strength in libertarianism because you see it all around us. The potential or the propensity of people to act in their self-interest is very natural, and because of that, people will are inclined to avoid pain. They will act in their self-interest. If they see that some action is going to lead to pain, they will do their best to avoid it. And so libertarians say, well, people acquire their property through work, and work is tedious, it's ceaseless, and it's painful. And so the problem is that people will sometimes choose to plunder the property of others because they want to avoid work. So the natural self-interest of people, the fact that people acquire property through work and work is painful, will sometimes lead people to plunder the property of others to avoid work, to use the work of others to avoid work, to avoid pain, for themselves in their own self-interest. And so that's kind of an identifying thing that libertarians want to us to recognize, is that we have to guard against this idea of plunder, which is something that is natural to human beings. So libertarians would argue that we need to prohibit plunder, and we're going to use government to do that. So libertarians say people create a common force, what they call the common force, and that's government. And that essentially government is a common force. It wields power for the group, and that common force is created for the purpose of defining plunder as illegal and punishing it. That's why it exists in the first place. We want government, we want the common force to define what plunder is and make it illegal and punish it when it occurs. And for a libertarian, this is the only legitimate government power, to define plunder as illegal and to punish it. And that's the sole purpose of governments, and it is the sole purpose of all laws. So you see that limitation on government power coming into play here. Creating a common force to prohibit plunder, but limiting that common force to that one power. So then, one of the great ironies of all this, and it's very troubling to libertarians, is when you create the common force, you create the danger of what they call legal plunder. The potential for legal plunder is essentially the use of the common force uh, to plunder the property of a person or a group of people. It's when they twist it around and the government then becomes the plunderer, so to speak, and they use the common force to plunder the property of a person or group. So libertarians, they're going to oppose any government action which takes the property of one person and gives it to another. So welfare, the progressive income taxes that we have in America, a whole bunch of other things that exist in our society, libertarians are going to see these things as a perversion of the law. And the reason it's a perversion of the law is because these types of things, legal plunder, makes legal what the law was established to prohibit. It makes legal what the government was established to prohibit, and that is plunder. So libertarians are greatly concerned. They know you have to create a common force to prohibit plunder, but they also are very concerned with the fact that that common force you create can then create a danger in itself of legal plunder. So libertarians also believe in free market capitalism. They believe that when people act in their self-interest freely, and to protect their own personal property, that you will get a good result. They believe in the self-interest of people, in their freedom and their right to protect their personal property. And they want to protect the ability of people to do these things. And so free market capitalism, we saw a more extensive definition of it previously. It's the idea of allowing free people to produce and consume in a free market economy with no government intervention. So libertarians are going to be laissez-faire as well, hands off, keep the government out of the economy, allow people to freely produce and consume in a free market economy according to their own self-interest and according to their own right to protect their own property. John Stuart Mill does a good job of kind of framing libertarian thinking. He said that, quote, that principle is that the sole end for which mankind are warranted, individually or collectively, and if interfering with the liberty of action of any of their numbers is self-protection. That the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. Sometimes this is referred to as what we call the non-aggression principle, the idea that there is just one principle, and that is that people should not harm other people, and government exists to stop us from harming each other. This is a painting by Thomas Cole, who lived from 1833 to 1836. It's entitled The Savage State, and I'm using it to help us to understand libertarianism, because you can see down in here in this part of the picture, you see there's a man, and the idea here is that this man living in the nature before government, basically, before we create governments and form the common force of government. What was the world like? And obviously, it's a tumultuous world. There's lots going on here. But the thing you want to understand about this man in this picture is it's meant to depict him as free. He can do as he wishes. All the choices that exist in the world are before him, and he is able to make them all on his own without obstruction from any other person. And that's a very important way to see libertarianism, understand their viewpoint on the great importance of basic human freedom. So in summary, in this presentation on libertarianism, we've talked about their central principle, freedom, their concern with plunder, their they're welcoming the idea of government as a common force only for the reason of prohibiting plunder, no other reason. And then their fear of the danger of legal plunder when you create a government, that the government might then legalize plundering the property of others. And then finally, their adherence to free market capitalism. So libertarianism is a very strong and important idea, probably the ideas that we've looked at the most succinct. Libertarians tend to really know what they think. They tend to argue in a very, very linear way, and they have a good understanding of their principles and what they're for, and they tend to be more consistent than a lot of other political viewpoints. But they also have difficulty in captivating enough people to actually become a dominant political idea. And probably part of that is because of their consistency and because their ideas are viewed as a little on the radical side at times. And as a result, they kind of have a hard time compromising and building a coalition. But still, even though they are not really able to yet advance political candidates to hold office and to elect a president or anything like that, they still are forming and speaking into a really important part of the American conversation when it comes to political viewpoint and political thinking. So here are some things to think about with regard to libertarianism. What are the strengths of libertarianism? What are the weaknesses of libertarianism? And are you a libertarian? And why or why not?